Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to take another look at Invention, but unlike my other videos that have focused on general PvM perks, we're going to be taking a specific look at different perks for Slayer. There are quite a few differences here when being compared to general bossing gear, so let's get right into it. Before we get started talking about the perks themselves, I'd like to take a moment to wage a quick objection to something that I see more and more commonly as people are doing Slayer with Invention. The thinking seems to be that by using a hybrid set of armor, like the Sliske armor from God Wars Dungeon 2 as an example, you save yourself both the time and money of having to make multiple sets of gizmos to use in multiple sets of gear. On the surface this seems pretty logical, but let's make a quick comparison to the most common alternative, which would be to use the tier 70 power armors from God Wars Dungeon 1. Starting with the attributes on the Sliske armor, assuming we're using the tier 80 version, the total cost is going to be about 40 mil for the chest and legs. That would be more, of course, if we were to be using the tier 85 version. The tier 80 set has roughly double the drain rate of the tier 70 armor we'll talk about shortly, and the tier 85 armor degrades in a completely different fashion, though it's obviously going to be more expensive in general, especially on Slayer where you're under attack by multiple enemies at one time. Because of the armor penalty, we're going to be getting tier 65 armor if we're using the tier 80 version, or tier 70 armor if we're using the tier 85 version. There's no damage bonus on it at all since it's a hybrid armor, and we can use it to activate one War Priest effect, though all of those sets are effectively useless when it comes to Slayer. By contrast, the tier 70 armor from God Wars Dungeon 1, if we were to buy all three sets of the chest and leg armor, would cost a total of about 16 mil based on current Grand Exchange prices. It has half the drain rate of the tier 80 armor, it has the same tier 65 armor rating because the penalty is slightly lower for power armor, and it has a total of plus 48 strength, which depending on what other gear we're using, is about a 5% DPS bonus overall. From this perspective, we're wasting an awful lot of money buying the tier 80 Sliske armor just to save ourselves about 30 seconds at the bank when gearing between tasks, and wasting about 5% of our DPS on that actual task, which is going to end up costing us more time in the long run. In my opinion though, the most important thing is that having a different set for each attack style gives us the opportunity to customize it with perks that apply to the tasks that we do with that attack style without wasting slots on ones that we don't. This does of course mean that we're going to have to spend a little bit more money making duplicates of some of the more commonly used perks, but because of the dramatic difference between the cost of using the Sliske armor versus the total cost of all of the God Wars Dungeon armor, we're likely going to be spending much less overall anyway. So with that said, let's move forward with the perks under the assumption that you're using a different set for each attack style. Getting the easy stuff out of the way first, your weapon perks are going to be the same as you would use for any general PvM. I've covered this in a previous video that you can access by clicking the card on screen now if you need more information on how to get these, but basically you're going to stick with Aftershock 3 on your main hand and Precise 5 on your offhand, or both of them together if you're using a two-handed weapon. Now with that said, I would be remiss if I didn't mention something that's a bit on the try-hard side and also extremely expensive, but can improve your overall kills per hour pretty significantly. This is the Caroming perk, and for each tier of this perk, the chain and ricochet abilities are going to hit one additional target. When using this in a circumstance that allows you to actually hit that many targets, you're basically doubling the damage that that ability deals, which is going to be a relatively significant increase in your overall DPS. There are some serious downfalls though. First, you need an extra weapon to put this on since you wouldn't want to completely eliminate Aftershock to use this. Secondly, it's not a cheap perk on its own, it's roughly as expensive as Aftershock is, ranging anywhere from 20 to 30 mil depending on how you go about gathering the components from breaking down the Sliske armor. And finally, this is kind of a high effort method. To do it effectively you end up having to switch weapons every 10 seconds to use the relevant ability, and it just generally makes Slayer a lot more effort intensive and less relaxing. Last thing before we move on to perking armors, there are actually some welfare alternatives when it comes to Slayer that you can use to replace Aftershock if it's just completely outside your budget. Frankly, any of the armor perks that we're about to talk about will fit in this slot, and that'll just free up an extra armor slot for you to use one of the other perks that you normally wouldn't be able to, so keep that in mind if you can't afford Aftershock. So now let's finally move on to armor perks where things start to get a little bit more interesting. For all of these different sets of armor that we make, there's definitely a core set of perks with very versatile application that we're going to want on every set, and then we're going to add little bits of customization around that based on the Slayer tasks that we do with that particular attack style. Obviously we're going to want the biting perk, that's free DPS anywhere. We're going to want genocidal, that's free DPS on any Slayer task. Impatient is going to be free DPS everywhere, and crackling is going to be free DPS everywhere. Our main form of customization is going to come from the Slayer perks, those being Undead Slayer, Demon Slayer, and Dragon Slayer, and that's going to depend entirely on what tasks we commonly do with which attack styles. Let's just start by talking about our melee set. We can get two of the big hitters done right off the bat using one of the combinations that I actually use on all three of my Slayer sets, combining Biting 2 with the Genocidal perk. There are a few combinations that can yield this. 3 direct components with 1 powerful and 1 undead component has a pretty good chance, 3 direct with 1 powerful and 1 bandos, or 3 direct with 1 bandos and 1 undead component. All of these components are relatively inexpensive. You can get the undead components from breaking down the tier 90 shields, the bandos components from any of the God Wars Dungeon 1 armor or war priest. The direct components are easy from anything like mithril or adamant battle axes, pickaxes, or spears. You can get powerful components from battle staves, though people are a lot less likely to use these since they're much more useful when making augmenters, especially if you're still training invention. It is a good thing that the components for this are relatively inexpensive as well, since it's probably maybe a 1 success for every 10 or so attempt shot at 120 invention, and that probably scales down by your level, so keep that in mind if you're trying to get these combination perks at very low levels. They're likely to be quite rare. If you have money to blow, and instead you're going to be using the Biting 3 perk on all of your Slayer armors as well from 5 Noxious components, which obviously is quite expensive, but there are probably some of you out there who are going to do that. You can instead combine Genocidal with some of the Slayer perks. 2 or more of the Undead components is going to give you Genocidal with Undead Slayer, 2 Bandos components and an Ancient component, which you can get from breaking down any of the 3rd Age items. Items like 3rd Age Vambraces are actually relatively inexpensive for these, can get you Genocidal and Demon Slayer together. 2 Bandos components with a Dragonfire component, which you can get from breaking down any of the Dragonfire shields or from Royal Crossbows, can get you Genocidal with Dragon Slayer. Again, if you're making any of these combinations, think about what tasks you're commonly doing. For example, since we're talking about melee right now, with the existence of the upgraded Dark Light, melee is your go-to choice for any demon task like Reaper Demons or Calgarian Demons, for example. This makes Demon Slayer one of the more desirable perks to combine here. If you also like to melee your Edamu tasks, you may want to get the Undead Slayer perk. And by contrast, the Dragon Slayer perk would be relatively useless for melee, since the tasks that you can melee involving dragons like Adamant dragons are relatively few and far between, and the ones like Rune dragons that come up more commonly require you to use ranged. We can also stick any of these Slayer perks on with Crackling 3 by using 4 explosive components along with either an Undead, a Dragonfire, or an Ancient component for Undead, Dragon, or Demon Slayer respectively. Again, these combinations aren't guaranteed, but they are relatively inexpensive and should be attainable for most of you. Again, at the risk of sounding redundant, make sure you're catering the Slayer perk to the tasks that you do most commonly with that attack style. Personally, I melee any task that allows me to do so, so I wanted to get Undead Slayer on my Crackling perk because there's a relatively inexpensive way to get the Demon Slayer and Dragon Slayer perk together in the same gizmo. There are a few ways to do that. You could use the 1 Ancient and 1 Dragonfire components, but those components are relatively expensive compared to the other ones. The easier ways are using 2 Dexterous and 1 or more Enhancing components, or 3 sets of Clear parts and 1 or more Enhancing components. Again, none of these combinations are a 100% chance, but they are actually relatively common, and again, the components are very, very inexpensive. That leaves only 1 perk remaining, which is Impatient, and we can get this from any combination of 5 Zamorak or 5 Zeros components, and we can mix and match as much as we want. I personally prefer just using Zamorak components, since you're likely to get it along with Devoted 2 or Devoted 3, which can come in handy on tasks like Ripper Demons. Though we are talking about Slayer, there's no major danger, so the defensive perks aren't necessary at all. You're fine with just Impatient. So, in review, using only our 4 gizmo slots, we've got Biting 2, Genocidal, Crackling 3, all 3 of the Slayer perks, as well as Impatient and possibly Devoted 2 as well. This is certainly the ideal for melee. However, if we're using ranged or magic, we're likely not able to utilize all of those Slayer perks effectively, and so we can reorient things a little bit to open up a slot for a non-DPS perk that can still be quite beneficial. For example, if we were to switch this for a ranged set, we don't really need any of the Slayer perks apart from Dragon Slayer, since Rune Dragons are the only Slayer task that people commonly range that are going to benefit from one of those Slayer perks. So we can go back to our combinations, and rather than trying to get Crackling and Undead Slayer, we can get Crackling alongside Dragon Slayer using 4 explosive and 1 Dragonfire component. That eliminates our need for this gizmo, and then we can fill this slot with one of 2 remaining perks that we might find useful during Slayer. The first of the 2, and my personal recommendation, would be the Scavenging perk, which gives you a chance to find components anytime you kill an enemy. The vast majority of the time these are uncommon components. A good portion of those will be enhancing or powerful components which you can use for augmenters if you're still training invention, which is likely to save you quite a bit of money, and the other uncommon things that may seem useless on its face can actually be used to make invention products which you can sell on the Grand Exchange and thus contribute to your overall profit when doing Slayer. They do also give a chance to give rare components though, and though that chance is small, because Slayer is literally just killing thousands and thousands of enemies, if you're for example going for 120 Slayer or for 200 mil, this effect will proc rare components hundreds if not thousands of times, and some of those components will be Illujonking components or Noxious components for example, so you can make yourself Aftershock 3 gizmos or Biting 3 gizmos for free and save yourself potentially hundreds of millions of GP. The caveat here is that at least the third tier of the Scavenging perk is probably the single rarest perk to get in-game. The combination is simple, you just need 5 precious components, but you also need a shitload of RNG. This is probably a 1 in 300 chance or lower if I had to estimate. A lot of people make the mistake of buying and disassembling jewelry from the Grand Exchange trying to get this perk, and they actually will end up spending hundreds of mils just trying to get it in the first place. But there are 2 nice workarounds for this. The first is obviously that you can settle for the second tier of the perk. It's quite a bit less effective than the third tier, but it's like a 99.9% chance when using 5 precious components, and so the effort involved is minimal. The second is that you can acquire the precious components at effectively 0 cost by adding a new task to your routine of dailies on RuneScape. You can purchase about 300 Slayer gems per day from a Slayer Master, make those into Slayer rings, and disassemble these Slayer rings for the precious components. Obviously this can be time consuming and the XP reward is small, though you do get the added benefit of getting tons and tons of enhancing components which will save you money if you use them to make augmenters to continue training Invention. Even with the extreme rarity of this perk, you should expect to get it within a week or 2 if you're doing this every day, and it's definitely worth considering in my opinion. Finally, the only other perk that might be useful in that slot would be the Trophy Takers perk. This perk gives a chance of any kill on your Slayer task either counting for 0 or 2 kills, and if you do all the math out, it's a net effect of about a 1% longer task per tier of the perk. The 5th tier of the perk is pretty rare, but the 4th one is relatively common, and you can even combine it with the Genocidal perk using 5 powerful components, and this is a decent choice if you're using it to replace Aftershock like I talked about at the beginning of the video. In all honesty though, the effect of this perk is so weak that you probably wouldn't even notice using it. You're at most going to get maybe 1% or 2% more XP per hour as you're saving yourself time between tasks by extending the tasks very, very slightly. I've mostly just included it to sort of preempt any questions you guys might ask about it. I really wouldn't recommend it, but it is there. It is an available choice if you should decide that you desire it. Thank you guys as always for watching. Big thanks to Armin and Born for Slay for their support on Patreon, and Born for Slay in particular as this video was his idea. Hopefully this sets you guys up to perk out your Slayer gear in the best way possible. As usual, if you've got questions, drop them down in the comment section below. I absolutely love answering those, and I will see you guys in the next video.